Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am so delighted and grateful to our speaker for coming. Our hearts have been really broken, and our frustrations just on the surface about what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And I know of nobody who could come and illuminate it with more clarity and inspiration and correction than our speaker this morning. He is a dear friend of this parish. And he helped us found one of our nonprofits. And so Salam and I went around town bragging that he was on the board of All Saints Church and that he helped run All Saints. And it was soon after that that I claimed the Muslim name Abdullah, and began fasting during Ramadan, which I'm not doing a very successful job of this Ramadan. I have to confess, my brother Salam. But he's the director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, is an outspoken advocate for understanding the true Islam, religion of peace and a religion of justice. He lives as a walking witness to me of what true interfaith friendship is all about. He's brilliant, he's articulate, I think he's so inspiring. And he's going to tell us all about the lens through which we should be looking at these troubles that are haunting us. So will you please warmly help me welcome Salam Al-Marayati.
Thank you, Ed. I think I'm going to take you everywhere I go for the introductions every time. That is something good, and you can drink all the coffee you want in Ramadan. It's okay. Your performance level is a lot higher, so just go right ahead. You do more than enough for the Muslim community. So honestly, I just wanted to thank you again for inviting me to be home, to come back home, and to be among you, among friends, and to have a conversation about how do we make sense of all the madness that we see, unfortunately, whether it is in northern Iraq, the Sunni-Shia conflict, in Palestine, Israel, 3 Israeli teens are killed, and then another Palestinian teenager is burned to death, and another Palestinian American is beaten by Israeli police, who I heard today was, the boy was released out on bail, so we were able to pressure the U.S. government to at least let them know that this incident is not going to go unnoticed. So there's predictable unpredictability in the Middle East, that you always can predict that things go crazy. When you feel like we've hit rock bottom, then it gets worse. So let's pause, step back, and think about a few things. And so here are a few points I wanted to share with all of you today. And actually, the theme of today's presentation is a question. Why does Prophet Muhammad matter to America? Who is Muhammad? And I'm not presenting this from a preacher's pulpit. I'm not here to convert people to Islam. We already have more than enough Muslims in the world. What is it now? 1.6, 1.8. Muslims are like rabbits. They just keep multiplying. It's the fastest growing religion. So anyway, we're not here to preach, to convert religiously. If anything, we're here to convert socially and to convert people who may have apprehension, even animosity, hostility, so that they become our friends. And really this is the motivation for this presentation. I don't know if I'm sure Ed has this, but I'm not sure if you've all seen this book, The 100 a ranking of the most influential persons in history. And this is written by, or compiled by Michael Hart. And number 1 is Prophet Muhammad. Number 3 is Jesus. And yay! This is not for some reason, this is not the crowd that I expect people to go, USA, USA! But anyway, the point is, why is this one person so influential? What does he mean to us in historical terms? And what does he mean to us as Americans vis-a-vis our relations with each other and with the rest of the world? And he's considered the most influential because he's basically a founder of a civilization. When we do mathematics, it was the Muslims that invented the number 0 and algebra and so many other mathematical applications, and the sciences in terms of chemistry. The founder of modern medicine is Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Ibn Rushd, a great philosopher, Averroes, his anglicized name, and astronomy and philosophy and religion. All that came in a civilization that started in 622 AD. And so something there is driving Muslims today. And Stephen Covey has one great principle that I've always come to admire and try to follow, that you have to understand before being understood. And I think we as Americans do not apply that very well. We want that immediate self-gratification. We want the answers. We want to go in and just solve all the problems of the world, and then we realize it's a worse situation. And in terms of our foreign policy, we tend to find more physical means of change through military force rather than social or cultural or even religious means for engaging the rest of the world. And the other reason why Prophet Muhammad was so influential is that, and what Michael Hart says, is that he didn't basically thrive from the coattails of a great civilization. I mean, the Middle East at that time was pretty much nothing. There was nothing there. It was the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire that were battling for control of the routes there. So my point is that understanding Muhammad is a key, one key. It is not, maybe not the largest key, maybe not the only key, but it is a key to Middle East peace. If we don't understand who this person is and what he means to 1.5 billion people in the world and what he means to the people of the Middle East, then any policy recommendation and initiative, at the very least, is going to be inefficient. And at worst, it creates a worse problem. And I also say that because there's this paradigm that is injected into the discourse in American politics as we view the Muslim world and Muslims, and that is Islam and the West. What does Islam and the West mean? It just means that we have a mutual otherhood. They're the other. And the way Muslims look to America, Muslims are the other. I mean, America is the other. So there is a back and forth, a dialogue that doesn't connect. It's two monologues that accuses one of being satanic while we are the saviors, accusing the other of barbarism while we're trying to enhance civilization, accuse the other of being primitive while we are refined. And it goes both ways. Even in war, there is the means of violence through drone attacks and bombings of countries that have already turned into rubble. And there is sending human beings as human weapons with suicide bomb jackets. So it goes both ways. And we have to pause then and say, let us understand what is really going on. And that's why I told Ed that I'd rather reframe the discussion of what is authentic Islam versus the unfortunate Middle East realities. And at the very least, we'll be more equipped to understand, and then we can try to be understood. So I use the example of one document, and I'm lecturing about this throughout the Muslim community. We had the 4th of July. Everybody went to the barbecues and had great picnics and all that. Very few Americans read the Declaration of Independence. Very few Americans understand what the Declaration of Independence means. And for Muslims, it's the same thing. There is a document called the Medina Constitution that the Prophet wrote. He didn't write, but he dictated in 622 AD. And very few Muslims understand or have read this document. And I'm just going to point out a few things to show that Muhammad and Islam did not just benefit math and the sciences and astronomy and philosophy and create the golden age, which they did, but they also created a means for effective modern governance. And that is what is missing in the Muslim world today. Strong central authority that gains consent by the people, that works for the benefit of the people, as opposed to what we see today. So the first part of this document, I highlight that it was dictated by Muhammad. Muhammad was not a literate person. He did not know how to read or write. And people would go and follow him and try to write things about his actions. And he would say, don't write that, because he didn't want to be adulated. He'd rather people follow his footsteps based on what the Quran said and whatever would be passed along to future generations. And so there's no what we call hadith, which is the compiling of traditions of Muhammad until 300 years after his death. But this document, he said, write it down. That's the significance of this point. He said, write this down. What it is a covenant. In other words, it is a social contract between him as the ruler and the people who he is ruling. He is a head of state now in Medina. I don't know if you know the story, but there was the exodus of Muslims from Mecca. They were fleeing persecution, and they ended up in another place called Medina, and that is when they formed a state. And Muhammad was not brought to Medina because he was the prophet necessarily, because there are non-Muslims in Medina. He was brought because he was able to reconcile between warring tribes and end tribal warfare in Medina. So he was a trusted peacemaker. Very different from Abu Baghdadi of ISIS or Bashar al-Assad from Syria or people like that, or Sisi in Egypt. So this is a covenant, a social contract that Muhammad developed. The first thing he did, he basically said, we are going to be an open society. We are not tribes anymore. We are an ummah. Ummah means community. So he transformed Medina from a group of tribes to one community. And he said, anybody that joins us and supports us and fights with us will be part of our community. Does that ring a bell in terms of what America is? Definitely. And he goes on to talk about all the different tribes and how each tribe agreed to these terms. And then we get to non-Muslim tribes. He says, any Jew who follows us is entitled to our assistance and the same rights as any one of us without injustice or partisanship. There were a significant number of Jewish tribes in Medina, so he had to allow for that. Again, he is not there as their prophet. He's there as their head of state, as their president, if you will. And then it goes on even further than that. Let me just go here. It says, the Jews of, and he names the tribe, are an ummah alongside the believers. So he says the Jews are not only going to be treated with fairness and justice if I'm going to rule in Medina, but they will have their own religion. There will be religious freedom for them. And I don't know if many of you follow Bernard Lewis, who writes a lot about the Islamic civilization and the history of the Middle East, but he says that the Jews prospered copiously in the Islamic era. So this was the seeds of religious freedom in Islamic civilization. The Jews have their religion and the Muslims theirs. Both enjoy the security of their own populace and clients, except the unjust and the criminal among them. So if you commit a crime or if you commit treason against the state, you will be handled by the state, but otherwise you get to practice your religion freely. And not only that, the Sharia, Islamic law, according to the Prophet Muhammad, dictates that religious minorities can practice their own religious law. So, by the way, this is considered one of the first constitutions in the modern era. Before this time, there was no such thing as a social contract between the ruler and the ruled to this extent. Aristotle wrote about constitutions, constitutionalism, but the way it's applied here is very, in my opinion, very impressive. No object of contention among you may not be referred to God and to Muhammad. May God's peace and blessing be upon him, for judgment. And so what we're basically seeing here is the transformation from tribal law to the rule of law. In other words, everything now will come to the prophet as the ruler for judgment, and based on the Quran, whose highest ethical principle is justice. And there is equality under the law. Everybody's equal before the law. These are obviously, for 7th century Arabia, radical changes to the structure in that region. The relationship shall be, he's talking about Jews and Muslims and non-Muslims, shall be one of mutual advice and consultation and mutual assistance and charity rather than harm and aggression. So the ruler's responsibility is to consult and to gain the consent of the people before he goes on with any decision. The town of Yathrib is a name for Medina, shall constitute a sanctuary for the parties. In other words, anybody that walks into this area shall be safe and secure. The people of this covenant shall come to the assistance of one another against whoever attacks Yathrib. In other words, there is the notion of a common defense, that there's no military hierarchy, nor is there really a religious hierarchy in this new state of his. We will form a common defense. Now, why do I mention all these points? Because, and I know I don't want to go too long with this. Uh-oh, I lost my cursor. Here it is. Okay. Because the 6 principles of good governance are exactly what we find in the Medina Constitution. It is an open citizenship, pluralism or religious freedom, equality under the law with justice, common defense. It becomes a sanctuary, and there is shura or consultation, which is the seeds of democratization. When you go further then and compare this Constitution to the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, you find that both documents are written by human beings but have a strong moral foundation. And just as Prophet Muhammad separated from what we call the Quraysh of Mecca to form a new structure, we find obviously in America how the 13 colonies separated from British imperialism to form a new structure. And in terms of constitutionalism, you find a common strand. In terms of religious freedom, especially in the First Amendment, in terms of equality under the law, as we see in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's why I don't like this notion that there is secular law and religious law. There is law that benefits people that definitely, when it's effective, it is based on a principle or a moral foundation. Common defense and a sanctuary, and the idea of consultation or democratization. All these are important principles that we find in the Medina Constitution. Now, why do I do this? For two reasons. One, it's to show that Muslims have as much of a stake, they are stakeholders in the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as anyone else. We are not here in America as the other. We are just a part of this great experiment in democracy as anyone else. We have these principles that are found in our Prophet's document that we find similarly in the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So when we say we are American Muslims, it is not somebody that's trying to get in. We are already in. There are just psychological and political barriers to our participation and full integration. And unfortunately, Muslims self-alienate themselves in America by thinking that there's the Dar al-Islam, House of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the House of War. And so if you're outside the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, then you are the other. It fits into that paradigm of mutual otherhood. Number two, but the reality is that we are stakeholders in this American democracy. Number two, by understanding this, we understand better what we can do to communicate with the Muslim world and how to communicate with them. Rather than looking at the Muslim world as a region that needs to be civilized, it is a region that is definitely in socio-political crisis, and our policies have only exacerbated tensions. It's like going to Kentucky where the Hatfields and the McCoys are, and then arming one side to fight the other and say, oh, I told you, America is filled with strife. Or siding with one race over the other, or one religion over the other. When that happens, it is very problematic. But more importantly, in terms of who is conducting policy in the Muslim world, there is not a single Muslim policymaker in our administration today. Every ambassador to the Muslim countries is not a Muslim. Unless we are able to overcome these internal barriers that represents America's greatness, then the most we could do is send money to the Middle East or have Saudi Arabia pay for it, which is what Kerry likes to do and every administration has done, and send them relief, and then figure out either war or which troops to arm and which groups to empower and so on and so forth. That's what happened after World War I. After World War I was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. What was Sykes-Picot? Sykes was a British foreign officer. Picot was a French-British officer, foreign officer. And they divided the Middle East according to what they thought was the best arrangement. And so the Sauds were given Saudi Arabia, hence Saudi Arabia. It was before it was called the Arabian Peninsula. And the Hashemites were taken out of Saudi Arabia and put into something called Jordan. and they made Jordan for the Hashemites. And then another Hashemite was given Iraq. And Syria, Lebanon were under French mandate, and Palestine was under British mandate. So there was a drawing of the lines. Today, we are witnessing the redrawing of those lines because the Kurds were left stateless after Sykes-Picot. So now they have to have a state. So what we'll do, we'll divide Iraq into three parts: the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurdish part. And then I don't know how many parts the Syrians will have. The Alawite and the Druze and the Christians and the Shia and the Sunnis and so on and so forth. We'll keep dividing up this region, which is very problematic. Now, some people ask, well, there are religious differences. And Ed we were talking about this radio interview my wife and I did last week about countering the Sunni-Shia sectarian divide. First of all, what is that sectarian divide? It is purely a political and historical division. One group felt that the son-in-law of the prophet should be the leader and the successor to the prophet. Another group said, no, his closest companion should be the successor to the prophet. And so it later became a political division. And Sunnis and Shias read from the same Quran, they follow the same pillars, they do everything the same, except in terms of how they look to Islamic history. And there are some denominational differences that we find among them today. And in the radio interview, the point of the interview was, my wife and I, she comes from a Sunni family and I come from a Shia family. We say the way to overcome that sectarian divide is for more Sunnis and Shia to marry each other. So it's that simple. And the reality is, for all intents and purposes, the division is irrelevant to the struggle facing Muslims today. Because every Muslim you talk to, oh, we need unity. We need to come together. We need to do this and that. But the reality is the situation in the Middle East has gone to such depths of darkness that you just need pause, stillness, before you can go and deal with any kind of recovery. So in terms of the points I was making, in terms of what the Prophet did, and going back to the Prophet and how we can communicate to the Muslim world in a more effective way. One of the problems in the Muslim world is it has gone from the sense of religious universalism to religious tribalism. And that's what you see today. There's the Iraqi Shia religious tribe and the Iraqi Sunni religious tribe. There is the Egyptian Ikhwan religious tribe, and there is the Egyptian da-da-da-da, whatever, tribe, and so on and so forth. So while we deal externally with the Muslim world, internally there needs to be a reform movement from this idea of tribalism that infested the Muslim world, that the Prophet departed from, and going back to the essence of what the Prophet taught, and to form Islamic or religious humanism. What are the 6 points I want to leave you with then? Number one, American Muslims need to be more integrated into American society, and we can do that by starting out with more of an equal footing, as opposed to this notion of Islam in the West. Islam in the West is an artificial divide that is imposed on people to make people different. It really is artificial. It is in people's heads. It is not real, and is definitely not God's will. Number two, approach the Middle East with greater understanding and greater respect for the region. There's no respect. When people go to Afghanistan, they want to take the burqa off. And the women say, no, this has been part of our culture. To understand, then, you see what is religion and what is culture. And let people continue with the culture that they feel is important to them. Number three, include more Muslims and Arabs in domestic and foreign policy making. We are still struggling to get a seat at the table with the policymakers of the United States. You know, President Obama has not met with Muslims in his 6 years in office. And it's basically, it's out of fear. Fear of what? Fear of AIPAC slamming him, fear of right-wing blogs, fear of people saying he's a closet Muslim, and so on. It's fear. Overcoming the fear will then make it so that when Muslims are participating, they are not infiltrating our society, they are benefiting our society. They are integrating into our society. And when we come to the church, what happened? It's like, my gosh, all hell broke loose for Muslims having a convention here at a church. So when that is happening, it's telling us that we have a long way to go internally in terms of pluralism in our society. And that will make us stronger in terms of being leaders on the global scene. Number 4, and this is the hardest one of the hardest ones, is to have, if America needs to decide, is she an honest broker in the Middle East, or is she taking sides in the Middle East? Is she on the side of Maliki or whoever in the Middle East, or is she on the side of this group or that group? Is she on the side of Israel, or does she want to be an honest broker? If you want to be an honest broker, then things have to change. If you're on one side but acting like the honest broker, you're going to get the worst of both ends. And therefore, then, when we look at terrorism, it is a problem. When we look at occupation of Palestinian lands, it should be just as much of a problem as terrorism. When we say the occupation is there, but we have a problem with terrorism, many times terrorism is the reaction to occupation. It is the illegitimate reaction to occupation. There are more legitimate reactions to occupation. Let us embrace those that have the legitimate reactions to occupation, but also look at occupation as an evil as much as we look at terrorism as an evil. Number 5, less dependence on Middle East dictatorships for stability. It pains me to see that the Gulf is the most stable part of the Middle East today. It is filled with despots. It is oppressive. It is the dictatorship that the United States is leaning on to wield influence in the region. And when we look to Iran, which is a form of religious dictatorship in the mullahs, we also need to connect with the people. There are people there. There are the Nelson Mandelas in Iran. There are the Lech Walesas of Iran. At the very least, let's not harm them by trying to buy them off. And at most, they can be the ones that deal with this nuclear problem in the world so that we look to Iran in the future as a friend, not as a foe. The major obstacle between the United States and Iran today is Palestine-Israel. When it comes down to it, it's all about Palestine-Israel. And that's the one thing U.S. policymakers don't want to talk about when they meet with us. They'll talk about everything else but Palestine-Israel. So having that friendship in Iran will be a way of dealing with the problems of nuclear armament in the region, not telling the groups, the haves, that you can go ahead and continue with the way you have nuclear arms, and the have-nots, you continue to work against that, which to me is a failing formula. Haves and have-nots have to be looked upon as equals. There are responsibilities on both sides. Finally, I pray that we overcome this problem of mutual otherhood and build what we, as Muslims and Christians and Jews in Los Angeles, have done between the Islamic Center of Southern California and All Saints Church and the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Leo Beck Temple and these great religious leaders here. We transform from religious tribalism and mutual otherhood to mutual brotherhood and sisterhood as people who are part of the human family, because if you believe in one God, you have to believe in one human family. Thank you very much.
So the mics are coming around. Please hold your hand up. We'll try to get one from one side and one the other. Here's a hand right here.
Salam, I'm going to take
Randy.
the privilege of holding the mic here for a moment.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask two brief questions. In 100 words or less, explain the caliphate.
Okay.
And then secondly, if the administration would meet with you, what would you tell them as far as a solution to Israel-Palestine?
Well, that's easy. I would just say, hire me. Anyway. And don't worry about what other people are going to say about me. Anyway, the caliphate is something that formed later on after the Prophet's death that basically meant the capital of the Muslim world. And there were times when there were two caliphates. There would be two capitals, Baghdad and Cairo, for example, throughout Islamic history. So it was basically the center of Islamic civilization that administered the government resources to the rest of the region, that governed over the region, that managed the armies and so on and so forth. That's all it really means. What they tried to make it sound like is that this is as if this is God's appointed successor to the prophet. And that is the problem. Is when, and this is how religious authoritarianism started. When people start saying, God put this robe on me and you can't take it off. That is the beginning of religious authoritarianism, and that was the beginning of the end of Islamic civilization. So all the caliphate meant was the capital. What it is meaning in political terms now is that it's going to be the one center that will unite the 1.5 billion Muslims. How they do that, nobody knows. They can't do that. It's impossible to do that. But the whole idea is they are using that for religious legitimacy. And that's what we have to understand. And then, yeah, in terms of what we tell Obama, I think the points of appointing Muslims, at the very least, to be ambassadors for the United States to Muslim countries, and then appointing a Muslim to your policy-making team. Those are two starting points, and then, we can go from there.
Okay, there's the mic. Yes?
Well, first, thank you so much for coming and presenting and giving us a view both of the Quran and the similarities between the United States Constitution and the Quran and the idea of the social contract. You mentioned something that triggered me, which was the idea of secular law was not something you supported because you thought most laws are formed from a moral standing. To me, it's not that secular law is not founded on moral principle, but the application of law is secular, meaning you don't criminalize or apply laws out of religious principles, but if the law doesn't, you change the law if it doesn't work. And over time, that's what we do. I mean, the United States is not, well, we've engaged in any number of...
Right.
Question?
Yeah. The question is, if you look at how do we acknowledge each other so that we each get to experience peace, the peace like for our own, the way we see God, the way we practice our lives, our culture. If I acknowledge you and you get that acknowledgement, that you experience me as accepting who you are without needing to change you, and I get the experience of you acknowledging me, then both of us get to be at peace.
Right.
But
Right. Yeah, first of all, I think, number one, I agree with you on the issue of secular law and its application. The point is that, when you apply any law selectively, it's not a just way of applying the law, whether it's secular or religious or whatever. So in that sense, Islamic jurisprudence actually developed a lot of secular means to applying the law. If you look at classical Islamic law, it's human beings trying to derive from what they believe are important principles and applying it to their time and place. That's a secular process, so I agree with you there. I think the bottom line in terms of how we look at each other is how we look at God. Is God only for the Christians, or for the Muslims, or for the Jews, or for this group? If that's how we look at God, then he's not God anymore. God is the creator of all. And therefore, when I believe in God, I have to believe in human equality. If I don't believe in human equality, then I'm not really believing in God. Number two is that my job in life is to establish, and what we're saying here about the Medina Constitution, it established the application of human dignity. God had bestowed human dignity on all of his creation. Therefore, your job is to figure out how to apply it.
Another question? No? Okay, go please.
And Assalamu alaikum, salam.
Like Salam.
Thank you for coming and sharing your views. I like the way you're dressed, so I'm comfortable with you in the West, because I'm in the West.
You like my beard?
No, that's okay.
Okay, that's going on.
But you adopted a certain way of dressing, and I have to. How do we spread this constitution, Medina Constitution, amongst Muslims so that we get educated in what is Islam and also follow, like Dr. Toots, we can be better Muslims. How
Right.
do we do that?
Well, we got a sign-up sheet right here. So anybody that wants this presentation made, we've done it to 10 mosques in this area alone. We're taking it nationwide. It is part of a lecture tour and part of the understanding that we need to have as Muslims before we really try to analyze the political differences that we see too often. We get stuck in that paradigm that we're the other, and we have to completely deconstruct that paradigm.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us this morning. And you've told us a number of very important things, but one thing we haven't talked about that's still an issue to a lot of Americans is the woman issue. Your wife has spoken out about this at our church here. But for example, this terrible problem of the young girls who were kidnapped in Nigeria, would you just say something about this, Salam?
I mean, before, there's something that our mentor, Dr. Hatut, said that I think explains a lot, may not explain completely situations like Nigeria, is that before you become a Muslim, you have to become a human being first. If you can't be a good human being, you'll never be a good Muslim. And part of being that human being is that your job is to be the caretaker of God's earth, not just a predator. And when we see predators like that, that means that people have completely forgotten what it means to be a human being, and therefore they use Islam for power. And that's also part of religious tribalism, is when you use it for power and for religious nationalism, so you become that caliph in that part of the world, and it just becomes your robe, your robe of authority, as opposed to looking at religion as a vehicle for service, for, as we said earlier, defending human dignity. So that it just makes it clear that this is, when you do things like that, treat girls as sex slaves and human trafficking, you've gone beyond anything that is normal as a human being.
Salam and all saints are joined at the heart and the mind, and he will be back. Thank you very much, my brother. This is perfect.
Thank you.